Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. Going to let people sign on to Zoom and join us for this morning's presentation. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nancy Proyact, President of the Orange County Citizens Foundation. Thank you for attending the third webinar session in the Hudson Valley Women's Leadership Conference Series, Empowered by Change. This is funded by the Orange County IDA and the Accelerator. Today, we are joined by Karen Washington, who will address how we, as a society, can redefine the power of community. The last 6 months have caused many of us to reevaluate our day-to-day life and the relationships we have with ourselves, family, environment, and community. Karen is going to educate us on how, by working together, we can redefine the power of community. Now, let me introduce you to Karen. Since 1985, Karen Washington has been a community activist, striving to make New York City a better place to live. As a community gardener and a board member of the New York Botanical Gardens, she worked with Bronx neighborhoods to turn empty lots into community gardens. As an advocate and former president of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, she stood up and spoke out for garden protection and preservation. As a member of La Familia Verde Garden Coalition, she helped launch a city farms market, bringing fresh vegetables to the community. Karen is also a board member of Why Hunger and the New York City Farm School. As a speaker, teacher, and mentor, she leads workshops on growing food and justice across the country. In 2010, she co-founded the Black Urban Growers, an organization supporting growers in both urban and rural settings. In 2012, Ebony magazine voted her one of their 100 most influential African Americans in the country. And in 2014, she was the recipient of the James Beard Leadership Award. Since retiring from physical therapy in 2014, Karen is co-owner and farmer at Rise and Root Farm, which is located in Chester, New York. And New York City too, right? Is that right, Karen?
Yeah.
All right, so without any further ado, turn it over to Karen. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this workshop, this conference, this speakers panel that I am about to do. First of all, I wanted to sort of just acknowledge the milestone of over 200,000 lives that we have lost because of the virus. I need to acknowledge that because I see the numbers each and every day. And I want to make sure that those numbers mean something to people and for us never to forget that there are family members, brothers, sisters, mothers, you name it, behind those numbers. So I just want to start off with that to acknowledge that. And the reason why I started thinking about redefining the power of a community, because I think the second question people ask when they first meet you, the first thing they'll ask is like, so what's your name? And the second thing they ask you is, where do you live or where do you come from? And I feel sometimes when you say, where do you come from or where do you live, it all of a sudden puts a preconceived notion about you. For instance, I'm from New York City, so when I go outside of New York, people claim that I have an accent. I don't know. Or they assume that I'm from Brooklyn and not the Bronx because it seems like all the foodies are from Brooklyn, but I'm from the BX. So I want to start first to say that, again, my topic will be redefining the power of a community. And I want to start by saying, as a farmer and activist, my reference and work is around the food system. This is my perspective, whether you agree with it or not. And I want to thank, first of all, the Hudson Valley Women Leadership for allowing me to speak today. Can we have the next slide? So look at this slide, because for centuries, women have been at the forefront fighting for equal rights, voting rights, civil rights, even through the present day Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. Our everyday struggles continue. I would like to first pay tribute to the women that you see in this slide. So let's start from my left. The first woman is Shirley Sherrod. So Shirley Sherrod is a farmer and activist and the former Georgia State Director of Rural Development for the USDA, who in 2010 was falsely accused for not helping a white farmer get a loan, but when in fact she did. During her tenure back in the 1960s, Sherrod and her husband founded New Communities, a 6,000-acre community land trust in Lee County, Georgia. That was the first community land trust in the United States that was to provide affordable housing and community development for Black farmers. But it was met with a lot of discriminatory practices from the USDA, and a lawsuit ensued. And in 2009, the New Communities was awarded over $12 million. Mrs. Sherrod remains active in pursuing land access for Black farmers in the United States. The second person is Tarana Burke, an activist from the Boogie Down Bronx. She started the Me Too movement in response to sexual abuse and harassment for women. In 2017, Time magazine named Burke, along with other people, as their Person of the Year, calling them silent breakers. The next is a friend of mine, Chef Pearl Thompson. She's a chef and activist who helped start Elijah Promise, a culinary school in New Brunswick, New Jersey. In 1977, it started first as a soup kitchen and food pantry and went on to become a culinary program to provide job training for local residents. Since stepping down, Chef Pearl plans to pursue her own culinary school, sharing the belief that good quality food is a right for everyone. Now down to my lower left is Edna Lewis. Edna Lewis is a renowned chef, author, teacher of Southern cuisine. She helped define American Southern cooking. As an activist and chef, she would inspire the next generation of young chefs to ensure that the traditions and folkways of the South would never be forgotten. Next is Fannie Lou Hamer, farmer, civil rights activist, who became one of the most powerful voices of civil rights and voting rights in America, especially in the South. Up against the segregated system of the South, Hamer fought to make sure that African Americans had the right to vote. As a farmer in 1969, she also launched the Freedom Farm Cooperative, where Blacks could own land and farm collectively. She started one of the first Black-owned cooperatives in the country. And of course, the notorious RBG. Big ups. A Supreme Court judge from Brooklyn, was an icon for women's rights, equal rights, fairness under the law, an inspiration for all women. She was the second woman to sit on the Supreme Court, but she started back in 1972 when she co-founded the Women's Right Project and went on to participate in more than 300 gender discrimination cases. Thank you for allowing me to recognize these women who have influenced my life and so many others. So I want to start with my personal journey that has taken me from the streets of New York City to farming with my friends on 3 acres of land up in the Hudson Valley. And today, talking about what redefining the power of community looks like. Second slide. Have you ever stopped to think about the magnitude of the food system? According to the 2012 United States Census of Agriculture, nearly 1 million women are farming. That's nearly a third of all farmers in the United States. As women farmers, we generate over $12.9 billion of annual revenue. We're not only farmers, but we're scientists, chefs, entrepreneurs, small business owners. We are also policymakers and activists. We are involved in every aspect of agriculture. And did you know that the majority of farmers in the world are who? Women. Yet the power, the land, the technology, and wealth lies in the hand of a few privileged men. So when we talk about community, let's keep in mind, even though we must act locally, we must think globally, because we're not alone when it comes to similar challenges and issues facing our community. Next slide. So what does community look like? Let's face it, these several months in isolation due to the pandemic has forced us to reimagine our relationship to self, family, the environment, and community. What lies ahead will either set us further apart in isolation or have us forge ahead to new and greater possibility of what social capital and communal wealth will look like. By working together, we can redefine the power of community. So, what does it mean to be in a community? Is it that we share resources? We work harder to be a better person? We take care of our environment? Or is it all the above or more? If so, it seems so easy. Then why does it seem there's so much discourse and division in today's society? We see this playing right now in our communities all across the country as we confront the issues of race, health, our environment, and income inequality. People are out of work, businesses are shut down. We see people on food lines and soup kitchens. People are dying, and we're wearing masks as if it's the new normal. One thing we can say about this pandemic, though, that is an equal opportunity virus. It doesn't care who you are, where you live, how much money you have. If you are exposed to the virus, chances are you will be infected. But what this virus has done is push to the forefront some of the inequities we see in our society and who truly are the essential workers. I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about myself, because I grew up in New York City, the Big Apple. I would say a middle-class household, family of four. My father was a hard worker. He was a salesman. My mother worked, but she was mostly a housewife. I grew up in the projects. Back then, it was prime real estate for men and families coming home from the Korean War. Many of my neighbors were Irish and Italian. Back then, my community was a melting pot of immigrants all reaching out for that American dream. I remember a community that took care of one another. We shared our food, our resources. We were blended families and traditional families. My brother and I attended public school, and of course, we got good grades. We knew nothing about the segregated conditions of the South. We were taught that education was the key to success. But somehow along the way, there were so many roadblocks and pit stops and detours preventing many of us from achieving that goal without hardship and regrets. As a youngster, I never knew why I left the comfort of community until I stepped into the real world, and that's when I saw that things would change. As a woman, a person of color, I had that added pressure to do the best, to be the best, that somehow education would unlock that promised door to success that otherwise would always be closed due to the color of my skin and my gender. For me, community was family and friends. It was a place that made me feel safe and wanted. Now, not everyone feels the need for community. There were those who believe in the value of equal but separate. But that separate did not always mean equal. There's been a long history of racism and segregation. Now there are folks that are going to say, why do you have to bring up the past? And I say that because in order for change to happen, you have to know why, how, and what to change. Is it our behavior? Is it our attitudes, stereotypes? Are there still systems in place that exclude, and divide. How do we look at our differences as assets and embrace it? If we're going to talk about what it means to be in community, we must be willing to do and go outside our comfort zone, feeling uncomfortable to be comfortable, to do that hard work that is needed. We as women in leadership must stand together. We have a powerful story to tell, one of self-reliance, determination, stewardship, and leadership. Today, we have a unique opportunity to change a system which should recognize diversity and inclusion as an asset. Next slide. Yet, we must face the fact in society that we are much more segregated now than ever. Our schools are segregated, our businesses are segregated, our communities are segregated, even our religious institutions are segregated. Folks, we are segregated. So when we talk about being in community, are we talking about it in terms of isolation where we all look alike? Or the broader sense of community in which diversity and inclusion matter? So let's go back to segregation, because even our food is segregated. Our food system is segregated. Now you ask, how can that be? We have fruits and we have vegetables and flowers sharing an array of color and diversity. Yet a whole food system of industrial ag has gone from diversity to monocropping, with emphasis on subsidy crops such as corn and soybean, to a charity-based food system of food pantries and soup kitchens. A subsidized charity-based food system's byproduct of industrial ag ends up in poor urban and rural community. It's cheap, no nutritional value, and it doesn't take a rocket science to figure where that food ends up. The question that I ask time and time again, we live in the greatest country in the world where we grow enough food and we waste enough food, yet that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most. So then there are people that say there's something wrong with our food system and it needs to be fixed. Think about that, because so many of you agree with that. Even I agree with that. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I was on the bandwagon, believing that it needed to be fixed, until I realized that the struggle for good food, clean water, brings to the surface the socioeconomic disparities we often see in communities of color and poor folks. And when we don't talk about and act on these disparities, it reinforces a food system that is controlled mainly by a handful of people with power. Think about it. Food alone has no power, but has now become a commodity and has been used as a tool for people to have power over others. It is estimated that the population worldwide by 2050 will increase in size to 9 billion people. That's an additional 2.5 billion people. And most of that burden will be in urban areas. Yet much of today's industrialization runs parallel with the advancement of technology and mass industrial production of food. But in the end, who benefits? So have we become a community, a farm system that looks at food as a tool, as a weapon? Has the land of milk and honey become the land of greed and money? Next slide. How do we allow a handful of companies to control the food system of millions and millions of people? We've gone from diversity to monocropping, based on a single crop, such as corn and wheat and poultry and beef. Farm subsidies, subsidies that were supposed to help the farmers back in the early 1930s, has now become a cash cow and a dumping ground for processed food entering our food chain with no nutritional value. We've gone from local markets to global markets due to our trade agreements, home cooking to fast food eating, and from seasonality to growing food all year round. Just think about the fact that we're eating strawberries and watermelon in December. Can we actually say that we're much better off because we have a food system that is less labor intensive, more efficient and specialized, more mechanized due to technology? Next slide. The American diet, once largely plant-based, full of fruits and vegetables and grain, is now animal-based. We're eating more, and as a result, our caloric intake has increased from 2,000 calories per capita to over 3,800 calories per capita. Folks, this is a wake-up call, a call to challenge the food system. When I first started farming, my interest and concentration was solely on growing food. It wasn't until I saw what the food system was doing to my community. I then started to realize and notice that food intersects so many social issues plaguing my community, poor communities, and communities of color, such as health, the environment, economics, education, housing, just to name a few. Even our farming habits have changed as it has become more analytical, data-driven, and local. Consumers now want food that is fresh and local, healthy and affordable. Farmers want to grow more efficiently, but they want to be paid for their product. However, the commodification of our food has caused us to focus more on profits and less on people and the environment. So now, once again, the question I asked you, does the food system need to be fixed? Think about it. No, I say it needs to change. And that change comes with power. Power which must go back into the hands of community. For too long, folks, we have been complacent and silent. And I say the two things that brings down any movement is complacency and silence. We have given up our power. We have given up our power to the government, lobbyists, and big business. We must shift the power dynamics of our food system that leaves women, communities of color, powerless and victimized. So when we talk about the power dynamic of our food, when does it show up in our society? Well, it show up as hunger when people don't have it. It will show up as poverty when you're too poor to afford it. It will show up as diet-related diseases as our food is killing us. It will sometimes show up as organic food, folks, because in some cases, organic food has become elitist. And of course, the power dynamic shows up in big ag when others control it. And for folks that were born in the 1970s under the Nixon administration, the then Secretary Earl Butz said to the small farmer, get big or get out. Understanding the power we have in our community means changing the way we view ourselves holistically and not how outsiders see us or say who we are or who we should be. Many times our communities, especially poor communities with limited access and capital, are looked at in terms of needs, deficits, scarcity, and problems. I had to change how I view my community. So when thinking about who we are, we need to look at our assets, our capabilities, our solution. Asking a community what they need comes from a place of deficit. Asking a community what they want comes from a place of power. We must value our social capital and communal wealth. Now, what does that mean, social capital and communal wealth? It means that everyone in the world has value. Collectively, we have the power to change, but many times we are pitted against one another because of bias or external factors. Next slide. For example, people and folks have often called communities with limited access to food, supermarkets, you name it. They've called us food deserts and food swamps. Now, I want everyone on this call to say out loud, food deserts. Come on, say it out loud, because that's the last time you're going to say that. Because it's a political brief and construct from outsiders would have us to believe that we don't have supermarkets. We don't have access to food. But yes, we do. I was in Tucson, Arizona in the beginning of the year, and they said, Karen, you know, we live in a desert. We got food. We grow food. And I tell people, it's not that we don't have food. What we don't have is healthy food options, because we have the fast food. We have the junk food. We have the processed food. So I tell people, it's not a food desert. I coined the term food apartheid. And many of you are saying, whoa, food apartheid. Yes, food apartheid, because I wanted people to start looking at the food system through a different lens. I wanted people to peel back the social inferences that food has when it comes to race, when it comes to demographics, when it comes to wealth. And I want people to recognize the fact that healthy food is a human right for all. And we must continue to have these hard conversations around our food system. Next slide. Another term you hear people talking about is food justice. Now, here's a definition about it. It represents a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating the disparities and inequities. And I tell people, when they talk about food justice, it doesn't exist. And they say, Karen, what do you mean? It doesn't exist because food justice has been co-opted. It has been used in so many people's food projects, grant applications. And I say that because when you look at the definition of food justice, you're looking at the word transformational. And if the food system is transformational, that means it's not a passive movement, it's an active movement. And so for me, if you are participating in food justice, then you have to be actively participating and working on the injustices that you see. Next slide. So what are some of the injustices that we see? Persistent race, gender, and class inequalities, lack of opportunity to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. What does that mean? Because time and time again, people are told that in order to do well, you have to, pull up your bootstraps and get to going. And the thing about it is that means nothing if you don't have a voice. If you have a voice in the decision making, if you don't have power. Next, land of loss due to theft, racism, displacement, and gentrification. People have to understand that the land that they're own, that they're standing on, has consequences, and we have to acknowledge the history of that land, of that access to land, how it was gotten, how it was stolen, and think about who were the folks beforehand who were on that land and acknowledge them. Economics, lack of living wage jobs. There is definitely a wealth inequality here in the United States that we need to talk about. Understanding, the lack of understanding the historical context of trauma. What does that mean? Folks, if you are people that have been oppressed for over 400 years, there is a link to the DNA of that trauma that we don't talk about, the abuse that we don't talk about, the fear that we don't talk about, that we need to talk about. And if we're going to move forward as a country, we need to have those hard conversations about the effects of racism and oppression and trauma. And the last is power, the willingness to control and have power over others. For many of us, our food and economic system has been extractive. We see our resources and money constantly being moved out of our community. We shop outside of our community. We bank outside of our community. We travel outside our community. We work outside our community. So when we talk about the situation that's based on base building and communal wealth, what does that look like? Next slide. Many would say it aligns with the theory of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of all peoples and governments to choose the way food is produced, consumed, in order to respect our livelihoods, as well as the policies that support this choice. La Via Campesina. And when we talk about food sovereignty, this was done by indigenous people in the global South. But again, food sovereignty has been co-opted. We have to understand what it truly means. The goal is less dependency on capital-intensive inputs that extract, and greater attention to the social and environmental principles that build communal wealth. In principle, equity in decision-making process and the distribution of resources when it comes to the common good for all people must be in the hands of that people, thus advocating greater control over food production and food consumption by people who have been marginalized by those with power over. Power. What does that mean? Hard to give up, y'all. Power is a drug. It's difficult to give up. But I say, as long as we have a food system that embraces a power dynamic of power over others, we will remain stagnant and resistant to change. Again, I want to read that again. As long as we embrace a power dynamic society of power over, it will remain stagnant and resistant to change. From small farmers to growers to food and farm workers, a healthy food system is not just about growing healthy food, y'all, but making sure all the parties along the way, along the food chain, are treated fairly and humanely. Food has become a commodity based on profits, not people. In order for the food system to change, we must face the fact that it's about sharing or giving up power. A food system that is dominated by white privilege and wealth with a historical frame of power over has to acknowledge that power, then give it up. So what must we do to change the food system? We must first recognize that true power lies within our community. More than ever, this pandemic has forced us to redefine what community looks like. We have now engaged folks to think about a local food system that supports local businesses and small farms and farm workers. We now know who are the people who are on the food lines and who are the people giving out the food. They're both the same. Businesses from mom and pop stores to big top name retail stores have closed, both feeling the economic crisis. Our food system on one hand is complex, but on the other hand is simple. There are dots along the way we must connect. From the person that puts that seed in the ground to the food that's on your plate. Together, this food movement is ours to take back. We all must play a role in building a healthy food system that is fair, just, equitable, and it starts with each and every one of us. Localism is not based on the I, but on the we. Next slide. If the food system and food is the ultimate tool that brings us together, we need people to do the following things. We need for us to think locally and collectively, demand local food and support the local economy. We now know who are the essential workers. Get people to realize the importance of knowing where their food comes from. Support the rights of farm workers and restaurant workers and grocery workers. As a farmer, I myself had to educate my community about the cost and value of food. Because where I live in the Bronx, it's a charity-based food system where food is given out and people believe that food is free. But I and others have to have that hard conversation that there's a value and cost of the food that we grow and bring to our communities. Support those working on community land trust and conservation easement to protect our land. Be open to the idea of land reparations for those who have had their land lost or stolen. And this is a difficult conversation, folks, about land reparation, because a lot of people feel that, oh, well, you know, I'm not responsible for what has happened, 400 years ago. I'm not giving up land, but let's talk about, the land itself. Do we really think that we own that land? Because once you're gone, do you still own the land? How do we think about land in terms of stewardship instead of always owning? How do we think about where we stand in our community, where we farm, who was on that land originally, and how do we pay homage to that? Demand healthy food and clean water for all. Both are human rights. Next slide. Speak up against hazardous work conditions at major food facilities and businesses. Make sure your elected officials are accountable. This is an election year, and we all should be asking questions. Break bread or have a meal with someone you don't know, someone outside your comfort zone, making yourself feel uncomfortable to be comfortable. Speak up and speak out when you see injustice. As I said from the very beginning, what has killed our movement is silence and complacency. But now you see the power of people speaking out and speaking up, going into the streets, demanding fairness, demanding to be treated equally. Strive for a community that cherishes diversity and inclusion as assets. But right now, folks, we have come to an impasse. as many people are leaving the city for the suburbs. There are many reasons. Some say social unrest. Some say unstable economy, the ease from working from home, or the fear of another pandemic. Whatever the reasons, what will these new communities look like post-pandemic? Only time will tell. History will tell you, though, that people of color and poor people are more likely to live in communities of concentrated poverty with huge economic and health disparities than others when resources are pulled out of their community, are limited or non-existent. If that is the case, it will take more than food to bring people. In closing, I want to leave you with a quote. Next slide. And I found this quote profound. It is by Jen Poo, as you can see, who is the executive director of the National Domestic Worker Alliance and co-director of Caring Across Generations. She said this while she was the executive director. And this is profound for us women, because she says, the greatest thing we did as women, we began to listen to our own stories. And that's when it happened. We stopped looking up to those in power and started looking around at the women beside us, standing beside us. Women from different backgrounds, working in different sectors, of different ethnicities, with different stories, and realize our strength is not in our individualism, but in our diversity and the power that we need to claim is our own. My name is Karen Washington. I grow food, I feed people, body and mind. I want to thank y'all. You can stop sharing the screen. I'm open up to questions. I know y'all got a lot to say. So you know what? Let's get with it. So thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you really for a very passionate discussion on food and community. I'm going to say food desert one more time, and that's the last I'll say of it.
All
I
right.
appreciate that. That was really enlightening and informative. I neglected to say at the beginning of our session with you that people can ask questions by clicking on the question and answer button on your slide. So if anybody has questions to ask, I know Karen, as she said, she's open to answering them. And I'll give everybody a minute, but in the meantime, Karen, I'm wondering if you can tell us how we might find resources in our local communities that earnestly provide assistance to all.
Yes, so I tell people time and time again, you got to go out your comfort zone and ask around. I live in New York City, and people ask time and time again, I want to get involved in growing food. And in New York here, we have over, 400 community gardens. And I tell people, go out, walk around. I'm up in Chester, New York, Rising Root Farm. This Saturday, we have a community day where we are inviting people to come to farms. Go visit your local farm. Go visit, other communities that you're not familiar with. And I think what this pandemic has is it's really put us in isolation. And I think we need to start, not only depending on ourselves and our family, but also on our community, because what is going to happen after this pandemic? Folks, we cannot go back. We're not going to go back. We can't go back to the way things were. We know who the essential workers are. So how do we move forward to support one another in such a way that is proactive and not reactive?
Okay, great. Thank you. Karen, that community day that you mentioned on Saturday, where is that? And
Oh, yeah,
Where
sorry,
can
it's in
you find
Rise.
information?
Okay, so this Saturday, usually the last month of the season of usually we start in May, but because of COVID, we're having our first community day this Saturday at Rising Root Farm, which is located at 168 Meadow Avenue, Chester, New York, 10918, from to 10 to 1.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I just want to talk a little bit about where Rising Root Farm is. It's located in Chester, New York, and it's part of the Chester Agricultural Center. And I want to say that because, folks, I retired from physical therapy back in 2014. And so my friends decided, you know what, we want to farm together. And we went up and down the Hudson Valley looking for land, and land was very, very expensive. And the fact that we're 4 women, 2 of us are women of color, 3 of us are LGBTQ women. The fact that there was, again, we talk about trauma, there was that hidden agenda for Lori and I, who are Black, about going out and searching for land, fearing that we will be rejected because of the color of our skin. Jane and Michaela are white. But yet we came upon Chester Agricultural Center, and I say that because, and this is something I want to give to the audience, it's about dreaming big. The only reason why we're at Chester, New York, is because I was sitting on a bus doing a farm tour of the Hudson Valley and spoke to the gentleman, Steve Rosenberg, I got to give him a shout out, who said that, you know what, there is this group of investors that is starting a farm cooperative for young farmers, small farmers up in the Hudson Valley, Chester. And so again, he gave me a telephone number and a name. And you know, folks, you get that telephone number and you say, I'm not going to call because you've been so used to rejection. But something said, Karen, call that number. And I called that number, and the person said, we want you, come up to Chester, New York, come see the Chester Agricultural Center. And it has been a godsend, folks. The Chester Agricultural Center up in Chester, New York, what it has done is the fact that it's a 30-year renewable lease, y'all. 30 years. I'm not going to be in 30 years, but 30 years renewable lease. Primary goal is to really help the next generation of small farmers. So I want to give a shout out to Chester Agricultural Center. They're the greatest. And for folks to dream big, put your dreams out to the universe. Don't keep them in. Don't keep them in, because no one's going to hear them. Someone heard my dream and made it possible.
Thanks, Karen. How, so, you've started nonprofits in the past, and you work closely with nonprofits and community groups. How can you find the resources, or what's your story of how you started those organizations? What drove you? I mean, obviously you had the passion for it, but you actually took the next step and created something.
Yeah, folks, understanding power. We talked about power dynamics, folks, for so long. Sitting back, we have given our power to people with power over us. I would say my own personal experience is being a community organizer, is understanding where the power lies. And the power lies in community. The power lies in people. And so working on, especially politics, y'all, when it comes to politics, food has emphasis around politics, land politics. It's like, okay, for so many years, people have been telling me that, if you want something done, it's the politicians and they have the power. And then I had to understand, wait a second, who really has the power? I have the power. And what I started to do is start asking questions, making people more accountable. For instance, where I live in New York City, I know everybody. I know my council person. I know my state senator. I know my assembly person. I know everybody because I feel it's my duty to go to their office, sit down and ask questions and demand change. Demand change. And why not? Why are people fearful of having that one-on-one conversation with elected officials? You have a right. And I feel I have a right to have those hard conversations. And so I try to instill in people, you have a right. If you're voting for people to be elected officials, you're voting because they're supposed to speak on your behalf. And you want to make sure they're doing their job. And if they're not doing their job, you have to make sure that they're accountable. And for me, it's about picking up the phone, calling, or going to the office and sitting down and having those conversations. And so I tell people, get out of your comfort zone and ask those people that you have put in charge of doing things for you, making them accountable. That's how I got started, by asking questions. People think that I'm a troublemaker. They ask all the time, Karen, why don't you run for office? And I say, I can't, because then there needs to be people like me to make sure that the people in office are accountable. So just keep that in mind. That's
great, Karen. That's very true. And just as a reminder, right, Election Day is upon us. So make sure I think yesterday we printed some dates for early voting. There's ways to get absentee ballots if you don't want to go to the polls this year. There's lots of opportunities to vote. We all need to do it. Karen, we know it's the harvest, and so you're crazy busy right now. But before we let you go, we had one question about you at farmers markets. There's a desire to support you and your partners in your farm. So do you do any local farmers markets in the Hudson Valley, or are there?
Well, we have a farm, so three things where we are located. So we're located in Chester, and at Chester Agricultural Center, we have a farm stand.
Okay.
So you can reach out to Rise and Root Farm or Chester Agricultural Center. We have a weekly farm stand where we are now, I think, a group of 6 farms, and collectively, our fruits and vegetables are resourced. And we have I think it's once a week that we do have that open market at Chester Agricultural Center. Rise and Root Farm, however, we are in Union Square on Fridays. And on Tuesday, I help run a farmers market that I have been doing for the last 18 years. I started the La Familia Verde Farmers Market in the Bronx 18 years ago, when y'all said we were a food desert. Outsiders saying we were food deserts and that poor people can't afford food. And so we got together with 5 community gardens and 4 rural farmers coming together and started that farmers market because we knew at the end of the day, everyone should have a right to food that is fresh, that is local. And so that's been a dream, to make sure that the food that we grow at Rise and Root Farm, that everyone has access to that food, because food is a human right, and we have to understand that. And I think food has been used as a tool to divide us. Food has become an elitist. We have to be very, very careful how we talk about food, because it's been used to divide us. We grow organically. We're not certified organic, but we grow organically in all of the farms at Chester Agricultural Center. They do the same. That's part of our mission, our vision, our history at Chester Agricultural Center, is that the farmers that farm there have to be stewards of the land. Again, understanding where we are. For me personally, being on the land is very, very spiritual, very, very spiritual. And I'm not trying to be religious, but I go out on that field and I look at the mountains and I look at the clouds, and I put my hands and my feet on that land, And I know there was so many indigenous people there. Lynette, I think it's the Lenape people that were there.
That's right.
And really to give them, you know, to give them praise for allowing me to be stewards of that land. And I think it's so, so important, because there's so many people, folks, that never get a chance to go outside and see, or be on a farm and see mountains and seeing green space, or see the black dirt that I'm in, the black dirt region, where you can put your hands in and you can put your feet and honor that space. And I try to do that every time I'm out there, that I honor that space, that this land has been given to us to be stewards of that land, and to remind us each and every day why we must protect that land, and to make sure that the history behind that land is told, that that land is not ownership. We don't own that land. We're just stewards along the way, making sure to keep that land for future generations. So I just want to acknowledge that each and every day, that I feel honored and privileged to be in that space as a farmer, to be a steward of the land. And I think that's very, very important.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know that we've put in the chat box some links to the Chester Ag Center, and also to Karen's email, her website, and also Rise and Root Farms website. So if everybody would visit those, that would be great. And as Karen said, this Saturday, there's an open
Community Farm Day.
Community Farm Day, thanks. The farm will be open. In closing, first, I'd really, again, like to thank Karen Washington for joining us today and for presenting so wonderfully, and for imbibing with us and providing us all this knowledge about our food and community. I'd like to thank everybody for attending the third webinar in our series for the Hudson Valley Women's Leadership Conference, Empowered by Change. More can be learned about Karen via the Hudson Valley Women's Leadership Conference website, which is hvwlc.com, or again at karenthefarmer.com. Our last session in this series will be held tomorrow, Thursday at 10 a.m. And Courtney Edwards will be joining us to discuss mindful self-care as a leadership strategy. So to attend that, or to register on the hvwlc.com site. And all of these sessions eventually will be available for viewing after the fact. But we hope you'll join us tomorrow. I'd like to thank Dean Brady and Melanie Schouten too for putting today's session together. And with that, I'll let everybody get back to work, and Karen, get back to the field.
Thank you so much, Joel.
Yes.
Remember,
Thank you,
dream
Karen.
big, dream big. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.